He didn't know the panel existed until it fell open, until the cold night and a broken leg of the dresser revealed a hidden drawer no one had touched in almost half a century. Inside lay a bundle that would unravel every lie the city had built around him and turn a mocked homeless father into the center of a fortune worth $30 million. But to understand how that drawer stayed hidden for so long, you have to go back to the day he first pushed that old dresser into the streets. A little girl at his side, and nothing left behind them but ashes. The man's name was Dan, though most people never bothered to learn it. His daughter, Lily, kept close to him as they moved through the morning fog, her tiny hand gripping the side of the dresser like it was a railing on a ship. The dresser was heavy, older than Dan, older than most of the buildings around them. People laughed at it, laughed at him, every time they saw the way he pushed it along on a squeaking dolly with wheels that snagged on every crack in the sidewalk. It looked ridiculous, sure. A homeless man with a child and a piece of furniture tattooed with time and grief. But he treated it like it was alive, like it was breathing, like it was the last thing in the world he wasn't willing to lose. And maybe, in a way, it was. That dresser had belonged to his grandmother, the same woman who raised him when the world proved itself incapable, the same woman whose gentle voice still lived somewhere in the back of his mind, even on the nights when sleep came slow and cold. He'd never meant to end up on the streets. No one ever does on purpose. Life has a way of stacking storms until you stop being able to tell where one ends and the next begins. The fire was the last storm, the one that took his wife, their home, their savings, their plans. Only 2 survivors made it out, Dan and Lily. The dresser had been dragged outside by the firefighters, left on the curb like an artifact from a world that no longer existed. He kept it because it was the only thing that hadn't turned to smoke. People mocked him for that. Mocked him for holding on to something they couldn't understand. Said it was a shrine. Said it was trash. Said it was proof he'd lost whatever piece of himself once lived in the real world. But the truth lived quieter than all of that. The truth was that the dresser smelled faintly of apples and old books, the way his grandmother's house used to smell. And when Lily curled up beside it at night, she slept better. So he pushed it, day after day, block after block, past coffee shops where no one looked up, past bus stops where no one cared, through alleyways where laughter always came at his expense. Eventually, people started calling him Dresser Dan. Someone filmed a video, then 2, then a compilation. The internet loves a spectacle, and they made him one. But Dan didn't have the luxury of caring. All he cared about was his daughter, and the dresser, and the next warm meal. One morning, a well-dressed man stopped him, a lawyer named Grayson, the kind of man whose shoes alone cost more than Dan had seen in the last 2 years. "Where'd you get that piece?" Grayson asked, running a hand across the wood. Dan's shoulders tensed. "My grandmother's." "Ever think of selling?" Dan kept his answer short. "No." Something flickered across Grayson's expression. Recognition, maybe even shock. But he hid it quickly. He handed Dan a business card and walked off without explanation. Dan slipped the card into his pocket, but didn't give it another thought. People like to ask stupid questions. That was nothing new. That night, it rained, the kind of cold rain that crawls through clothes and bones. Dan pushed the dresser beneath the overhang of an abandoned storefront. Lily fell asleep with her head against the lower drawer. Dan sat beside her, listening to the rain whistle off the broken gutters. And then he heard it. A soft click. Wood shifting inside itself. He thought maybe the dresser was finally falling apart. Would have been fair. Everything else had. But when he reached under the lowest drawer to check the damage, his fingers brushed against something that had never been there before. A small indentation, almost like a button carved into the wood grain. He pressed it. Another click. The bottom of the drawer dropped inward an inch, as if releasing a breath that had been held for decades. Dan froze. Carefully, he pulled the drawer out. Behind the false bottom lay a tightly wrapped cloth bundle, tied with a ribbon so faded it looked gray in the dim light. His hands trembled. He'd inherited the dresser when his grandmother died, but she'd never said anything about a hidden compartment. Then again, she'd always been a woman of secrets and quiet wisdom. Dan hesitated, glancing at Lily sleeping peacefully beside him. Then he unwrapped the bundle. Inside were documents, dozens of them. Ownership papers, deeds, bank certificates, old bonds. A letter with his grandmother's handwriting across the front, for when he is ready. He unfolded it with hands that suddenly felt foreign to him. "My sweet boy," it began. "If you're reading this, then life has taken more from you than I ever hoped it would. But I learned long ago that a person cannot be protected from the world, only prepared. Our family's legacy is not money, it is resilience. But strangely enough, money is what I leave you. The investments are real, the land is real, the accounts are real. I hid them because I feared what this fortune could do to you, before you understood who you were. If you are reading this now, it means you've suffered. It means you've changed. It means you are ready to rebuild." At the bottom of the bundle was a list of accounts, modern accounts, updated only a few years before her death. When Dan added the numbers together, his vision blurred. 30 million. $30 million tied to his name. 30 million, hidden in a dresser people mocked him for. 30 million, sitting in the streets while strangers laughed. His breath caught, not from greed, but from something heavier. Relief so sharp it hurt. He looked at Lily. Her lashes fluttered as she dreamed. She had no idea their life had just shifted beneath them like tectonic plates finally giving way. Dan didn't sleep at all that night. By sunrise, he had memorized the documents twice over. By mid-morning, he had walked with Lily to a public library to use a computer. By noon, he had called the only lawyer whose name he had, Grayson. The man answered on the first ring. "I was hoping you'd find what was inside," Grayson said, voice low, almost reverent. "Bring the documents to my office. We'll secure everything properly." "How did you know?" Dan asked. "Your grandmother was a client of mine," Grayson replied. "She trusted me with the instructions." Dan closed his eyes. The pieces of his life were fitting together with an eerie, perfect click, like the secret panel opening. "Why didn't you say anything yesterday?" "Because it wasn't my place," Grayson said simply. "She wanted you to choose to look. You had to open it on your own." The next few days moved like a dream. Papers were verified, accounts were reclaimed, properties were transferred. The media caught wind of the story. A homeless father who had been sleeping beside a fortune. People who once laughed at him now watched in stunned silence. Some tried to apologize, some asked for interviews, some pretended they had always treated him kindly. Dan ignored all of them. Money didn't erase pain. It didn't erase nights under bridges. It didn't erase Lily's cries when she was cold. But it did give them something they hadn't had in years. Safety. A key to a door that locked. A room with heat. A future. Yet even after they moved into a small but warm house, Dan kept the dresser. Not because he needed it anymore, but because it had carried him through every version of his life. Sometimes, late at night, he would run his hand along its surface, feeling the grooves and scratches like old scars. Lily would ask, "Daddy, why keep it?" And he'd answer the same way every time. "Because some things you don't throw away, sweetheart. Some things save you before you even know they're trying." The dresser sat quietly in the corner of their new home, no longer mocked, no longer pitied, just a witness to a journey that almost broke them and then, miraculously, stitched them back together. And even though the hidden drawer now lay empty, the mystery it carried never fully left the air around it. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. Some wait for the exact moment a person is ready to open them. And sometimes, the thing everyone laughs at is the very thing that holds the world they've lost and the world they're about to find. Dan didn't mean for the dresser to become a symbol, but it did, almost overnight. The neighborhood where people once crossed the street to avoid him now watched with a strange mix of awe and guilt every time he passed by. The story had spread faster than he imagined possible, carried on whispers, then on phones, then on the hungry mouth of the internet. But he didn't walk around with pride. He walked with caution, with the same slow, measured steps as before, as if the ground of his new life was still fragile and thin in places. Lily adjusted more quickly than he did. Children adapt. They bend with the wind instead of breaking beneath it. She loved their new home in a quiet part of town, a small place with pale yellow walls and a backyard that wasn't much bigger than the dresser itself. But to her, it was a kingdom. She planted wildflowers along the fence and named each sprout as it grew. Dan watched her from the back steps some mornings, coffee warming his hands, the chill of old habits still clinging to him. You don't stare down darkness for years and forget its shape just because someone turns on a light. He checked the locks twice every night. He woke up at the slightest sound. He listened to the rain differently now, not as an enemy, not as a reminder of cold concrete nights, but with a wary sort of respect. And always, his eyes drifted back to the dresser. It sat in the corner of the living room, sunlight catching the faded scratches, the edges worn smooth from years of his hands, guiding it through streets and storms. Sometimes he wondered if his grandmother had planned it all this way, if she had known he would need something to hold on to, something heavy enough to keep him anchored when the world took everything else. But life wasn't that neat. People didn't come with instructions. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more inside the dresser than what he had found. Not more valuables, not more money or bonds or deeds, but something deeper. A message he hadn't fully deciphered. The letter she left him ended too simply, too abruptly, as if she had intended to say more but ran out of time. He caught himself thinking about it late at night, about the cryptic tone beneath her words. She wanted him to rebuild, to understand something he hadn't yet understood. The first quiet tremor of unease started there. He didn't mention it to Lily. She was happy, lighter than she'd been in years. And Dan didn't want to stain that brightness with the shadows that still circled his thoughts. One rainy afternoon, while Lily napped on the couch, curled under a blanket decorated with cartoon animals, Dan pulled the dresser slightly away from the wall. His heart beat faster without reason. It felt like trespassing, like digging into a grave of memories he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He opened each drawer slowly, inspecting them with a care he hadn't used since the day he found the hidden panel. But he found nothing except the familiar smell of old wood and a few stray threads clinging to the corners. He almost closed the last drawer when something caught his eye, a single nail, different from the others, slightly brighter, newer, as if someone had replaced it not long before the dresser came into his possession. His breath hitched. He touched the nail, and for a moment it felt warmer than it should have been. Then he told himself it was nothing, just a trick of the mind. He let out a slow breath and stepped back. He had a habit of searching for danger where none existed. Years on the street taught him that. But that was survival mindset, not reality, or so he tried to convince himself. Days passed, then a week. Life settled into a strange but pleasant rhythm. Lily started school again. Dan worked with Grayson to sort out the last of the accounts, the last of the legal knots that had grown around his grandmother's fortune. Every time he visited the lawyer's office, he felt an echo of disbelief. The sleek halls, the quiet carpets, the glass walls that showed a city he used to walk through invisible. People opened doors for him now. His clothes didn't draw stares. The world suddenly acted like he was part of it again. But the memory of how quickly it cast him out still lived under his skin, like a scar you forget until your fingers brush it. One Thursday afternoon, Grayson invited him into the conference room and slid a thin folder across the table. These were the only remaining sealed documents connected to your grandmother's estate, he said. I didn't open them. They're yours alone. Dan stared at the folder. It looked small, ordinary. But weight had nothing to do with size. He took it slowly, as if it might burn him. Are you expecting anything inside? Grayson asked. Dan shook his head. I thought she told me everything she wanted to. Sometimes people say more after they're gone, Grayson said quietly. Something in his tone made Dan look up, but the lawyer's face gave nothing away. When Dan got home, Lily was outside in the yard, chasing a ladybug with careful steps. He went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the folder. A letter, a single photograph, and a key, small, brass, old. The letter was short. Daniel, if the time has come for you to read this, then you've opened the drawer you weren't meant to open until life demanded it. Only one task remains, one truth I couldn't give you while I was alive, though I wanted to. The dresser was not my hiding place. It was his. Ask the house. Ask the land. The truth is waiting beneath the roots. Attached was a photograph of a man Dan didn't recognize. Tall, weathered face, eyes sharp but kind. One hand rested protectively on the same dresser, though it looked newer in the photo. Rich, polished, unscarred by years. On the back of the photo, written in the same looping handwriting, were 4 words. He wasn't just family. Dan felt a coldness underneath his ribs. The key gleamed faintly in the kitchen light. He didn't know what it opened. He didn't know who the man was. But the phrase "ask the house" haunted him. His grandmother had lived in the countryside for most of her life, in a home surrounded by towering oak trees, the kind that lived for centuries. The fire had destroyed his own home, but hers still existed. He hadn't been back since her funeral. He had avoided the place, partly because it hurt too much, partly because it felt like walking into the past. But the letter forced his hand. That night, after Lily fell asleep with her fingers tangled in her hair the way she always did, Dan stood in the living room staring at the dresser again. The house, the land, beneath the roots. The words circled him like wind. He thought he had already excavated all the buried things in his life, but apparently not. The next morning, he packed a small bag for Lily, told her they were going on a short trip, and loaded her into the used car he'd bought 2 weeks earlier. She was excited just to go anywhere. The drive took 2 hours, most of it through winding back roads framed by whispering trees. Dan's stomach clenched tighter the closer they got. He wasn't afraid, not exactly. Just unsettled, like someone walking toward a memory that might turn around and glare back. When they arrived, the house looked exactly as he remembered. A modest wooden structure painted white, though the paint had peeled in many places. The porch creaked when the wind touched it. The oak trees still stood tall, branches stretching like old guardians watching from above. Lily ran toward the nearest tree, marveling at its size, her laughter echoing across the yard. Dan stood still. The air felt heavier here. Different. He walked slowly toward the porch, each step stirring old dust in his mind. The front door stuck the way it always had, but after a firm push, it opened. Inside, the house smelled of age and quiet, like time had been holding its breath. He stepped in cautiously, Lily close behind him. Everything remained where it had been years ago. The worn sofa, the faded rug, the framed photographs on the walls. It felt wrong that the world could change so violently while this house remained untouched. After a long moment, Dan pulled out the brass key. It didn't look like a house key, more like a key to a chest or a box or something older. He searched the house methodically, the bedroom, the closets, the attic stairs that groaned under his weight. Lily stayed beside him the whole time, eyes wide with curiosity. "Daddy, what are we looking for?" "Something Grandma left us." "Like a treasure?" He hesitated. "Maybe." They found nothing upstairs. The key didn't fit any drawer, any cabinet, any lock. As he walked back toward the living room, exhaustion tugged at him. He wondered if he'd misunderstood the letter, if grief had made him read too much into cryptic words. But then he saw it. A floorboard near the fireplace, slightly misaligned, barely noticeable unless you were looking for something to notice. His heart thudded once, hard. He knelt down and pressed on the board. It shifted. Lily gasped softly. Beneath the loosened floorboard was a small brass lock, tarnished, ancient, built into the floor itself. Dan inhaled deeply, pulled out the key, and slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly. One twist. A click echoed through the room, a sound like a sigh long held. Dan lifted the wooden panel. Beneath it lay a compartment lined with velvet. Inside that, wrapped in cloth older than he was, lay a book, a journal, thick, leather-bound, edges cracked from age. He took it gently, brushing dust from the cover. Lily leaned closer. "What is it?" "I don't know yet," Dan whispered. The journal's first page was written in elegant handwriting he didn't recognize, not his grandmother's, not anyone's he'd ever seen. Whoever wrote it had lived through something. You could feel the weight of it in every stroke. Dan read the first lines aloud under his breath. "I built the dresser to protect the legacy I could not speak of in my lifetime. This land carries truths older than we are. If you are reading this, then you carry the bloodline and the burden that comes with it." Dan froze. Burden. The word rang heavy. He kept reading, eyes moving faster now. The journal told the story of a man named Elias, the man from the photograph. A craftsman, yes, but more than that. A guardian of something hidden on the land, something tied to the oaks, something he had sworn to protect for as long as he lived. And when he realized he wouldn't live long enough, he entrusted the secret to his daughter, Dan's grandmother, a secret she later passed, unknowingly or not, to Dan. But the journal didn't say what the secret was. Not directly. It spoke in metaphors, in warnings, in fragments of history laced with caution. And then, near the middle of the book, Dan found a sentence that made his blood run cold. "The treasure is not gold or jewels or bonds. The wealth of our line is knowledge, dangerous to the wrong hands, priceless to the right ones. It must remain buried until the one who seeks it carries both loss and mercy in equal measure. Dan closed the book slowly, staring at the words until they blurred. Knowledge, buried beneath the roots, a legacy he never asked for. He thought finding the 30 million was the end of the story, but it was nothing more than the outer layer, a decoy, a distraction. The true inheritance lay somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath the ancient oak trees outside. He felt Lily slip her hand into his. "Daddy?" "Yeah? Are you okay?" He squeezed her fingers. "I'm just thinking. About the treasure?" He looked at her hopeful eyes, and felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. "Yeah," he whispered. "About the treasure." The last rays of sunlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the room, the dresser in their new home, the journal in his hands, the oaks outside whispering with the wind. He could feel the past shifting beneath him, aligning, unlocking, and he knew, with a heaviness he couldn't name yet, that whatever waited beneath those roots would change everything again. But this time, there would be no laughing crowds, no viral videos, no easy explanations. This part of the journey was meant only for him, and for Lily, who had already weathered more storms than any child should. Dan closed the journal, took a deep breath, and stepped out onto the porch as dusk settled over the land like a soft, somber curtain. The oak trees stood tall and silent, waiting. He held the journal to his chest. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "we'll see what you've been hiding." The wind stirred, gentle but insistent, as if the land itself exhaled, relieved that at last someone was finally listening. Morning came with a thin, gray light that made the dew on the grass shimmer like 100 tiny truths he hadn't asked to see. Dan woke before Lily, instinctively, the way he had on the streets, when being awake meant being a little safer. For a while, he just lay there on the narrow bed in the old house, listening. The familiar creak of wood settling, the distant call of a bird, the soft, measured sound of his daughter's breathing from the mattress on the floor beside him. Nothing felt threatening. It was the absence of threat that unsettled him now. He sat up slowly, rubbed his hands over his face, and reached for the journal on the small table by the bed. The leather felt cooler than the air. He flipped through the pages again, his eyes catching on phrases he'd skimmed before, sentences that stubbornly refused to give up their full meaning. The roots remember. The land keeps what men try to bury. The dresser is only the doorway. The ground is the vault. He closed the book with a soft thud. He had money now. Enough to never worry about food or shelter again. Enough to buy new dressers for the rest of his life if he wanted. But what lay under the oak trees felt different from that. Older, less negotiable. Lily stirred beside him. Her eyes blinked open, hazy with sleep. "Is it today?" she asked, voice small in the quiet room. "Yeah," he said. "It's today." She pushed herself upright, hair in wild tangles, and smiled, the kind of unguarded smile that always punched straight through his chest. "We're going treasure hunting," she said. He didn't correct her. Let it stay a treasure, for now. Let it stay simple in her world a little longer. They ate a quick breakfast from the supplies they'd brought. Crackers, fruit cups, juice boxes. Then they stepped out into the yard. The air outside was cool and damp. Mist clung to the lower branches of the oaks, wrapping them in a faint, ghostly veil. The trees towered above them, trunks wide and rooted, branches woven together like old fingers interlaced in prayer. Dan stood there for a long moment, the journal tucked under his arm, trying to decide where to even begin. There were dozens of trees, hundreds, each one old enough to remember things humans had forgotten. Lily walked ahead, scanning the ground like a detective. "Does it say which one?" she asked. "No," Dan said. "It just says the land, the roots." She frowned, scrunching her nose. "That's not very helpful." He almost laughed. "Grandma had a thing for riddles," he said. "I think she liked making people think too much." "You think too much," Lily replied without malice, just stating a fact. She wasn't wrong. Dan opened the journal again, leaning against the nearest tree. He reread a passage he'd skimmed the night before. "I chose the oldest of them, the one that watched over the house before any other. I marked it with what our line holds most dear, a sign no stranger would notice, but no family could miss." His gaze drifted from the page to the trees. "The oldest. How do you tell old from older when they're all wearing the years like armor?" He stepped closer to each trunk in turn, running his hands along the bark. Some were smoother. Some had deeper grooves. Some bore scars where lightning had once kissed them. Nothing that screamed, "This one." Then, as he circled near the rear of the property, his hand brushed against something that didn't belong. A small carving, almost swallowed by the bark. A symbol. 2 lines crossing, forming a simple, rough X with a circle around it. It was the kind of thing he would have dismissed as random if he hadn't been looking for a sign. Lily spotted it at the same time. "There!" she shouted, pointing. "That's it. That's like the mark you draw when you don't know an answer." "Or when you're marking something important," Dan said. His heart thudded harder now, not from fear so much as from the weight of inevitability. He knelt at the base of the tree. The roots twisted out of the ground like frozen waves, thick and gnarled. Between them, the soil was hard-packed, stubborn. He glanced back at the house. "We'll need something to dig with," he said. Lily was already running toward the shed he remembered from his childhood. The door groaned when she pulled it open. A moment later, she emerged with a shallow, rusted shovel and a smaller hand trowel. "This one's mine," she said, brandishing the smaller tool with pride. "Deal," he said. They started digging. The soil fought them at first, clinging to its secrets. Dan's muscles burned a little. He wasn't used to this kind of labor anymore. On the streets, it had been more about endurance than strength. But there was something grounding about the repetition. Press, lift, toss, press, lift, toss. Lily hummed under her breath as she dug in smaller arcs between the roots, her determination fierce. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. A shallow pit formed, big enough for Lily to stand in. Dirt streaked her cheeks and clung to her hair. Dan's hands grew raw where the shovel handle rubbed against skin. But he kept going. At some point, he stopped thinking about the money in his accounts, the fancy folders in Grayson's office, the city that had mocked him. All that existed was the earth, the tree, his daughter's small, steady presence, and the question rising slowly from below. His shovel struck something solid with a dull, hollow sound. He froze. "Daddy?" Lily whispered. "Hear that?" He tapped the same spot again. Another dull thud. Not rock, not root, something made by hands. Carefully, he cleared the dirt away until the shape of a box emerged. Metal, rust-kissed but intact, edges softened by time. It was about the length of his forearm, heavy-looking even before he tried to lift it. His breath lodged in his throat. He dug his fingers around the edges, pried it loose, and hoisted it out of the ground. It was heavier than he expected. He set it down on the grass. At the front of the box, just beneath a swirl of corrosion, was a keyhole. His hand moved almost on its own. He pulled the small brass key from his pocket, the one that had opened the floorboard compartment in the house. It slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting all these years for this exact motion. The lock turned with a reluctant click. For a second he hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, there was no gold, no jewels, no bundles of cash. Instead, there were papers. So many papers. Some were brittle and yellowed with age, others more recent, their edges crisp. On top lay another journal, thinner than the first, with a name etched faintly into the leather. Elias Ward, the man from the photograph. Beneath the journal were maps, newspaper clippings, legal documents, a worn envelope with a municipal seal broken long ago, and something else. A small wooden box nestled in the corner, no bigger than his palm. Lily leaned closer, eyes wide. "It's not like the last treasure," she said, a hint of disappointment in her voice. "No," Dan said softly. "It's not." But his chest felt tight for a different reason. He picked up the small wooden box first. It didn't have a lock, just a sliding lid. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a simple silver ring, tarnished but beautifully crafted, with a small engraving on the inside, 3 initials that matched his grandmother's. He unfolded the paper. It was a note, shorter than the others, written in Elias's hand, for the one who chooses to stay. "The wealth you think you seek is only a doorway. What lies beyond it is the true measure of what you will be." Dan swallowed hard, then set the note aside and opened the journal. The first entry was dated nearly 70 years earlier. The writing was dense but urgent, the hand of a man who knew he was racing time. "I write this with the understanding that what we know can be used to build or destroy, to heal or to hollow out. This land does not belong to the men who claim it. It belongs to the people who keep its stories. My father kept them in his head. I keep them here, in these pages, and in the place beneath the roots." Dan flipped forward, skimming. The entries told a story that sounded almost unreal on the surface. Elias and his family had been witnesses to something the city had done decades earlier, during a time when expansion had mattered more than lives. Eminent domain, they called it. Progress. Entire neighborhoods uprooted, families pushed out with promises that never materialized. But buried in these pages were details the official record had conveniently forgotten. Deals made in back rooms, signatures forged, land stolen not just by law, but by lies. Elias had gathered proof, documents, transcripts, maps showing what once stood where shiny glass now gleamed, names of officials who had profited, companies that had built their empires on razed homes and displaced people. "Daddy?" Lily's voice pulled him back. "What is it?" He sat down on the ground, the journal open across his knees. "It's a story," he said slowly. "A part of the city's story no one wanted to talk about." "Is it bad?" "Yeah," he said, honest because he'd always promised himself he wouldn't lie to her about the important things. "It's bad." "Then why did Grandma keep it?" He thought about that for a long moment. "Maybe because someone had to," he said. He turned to the back of the journal. The last few pages were written years later, the handwriting shakier, the lines more spaced out. "I have enough here to ruin them," Elias had written, "to bring the truth into the light and take back what they stole from so many. But power never changes hands without cost. My family is already marked by what we know. I will not let violence bloom from justice. So I leave this instead as a choice. The one who inherits this land will decide, expose what was done, and risk tearing open wounds in a city that built itself over bones, or use this knowledge quietly to restore what can be restored without setting the whole place on fire." Dan closed the journal, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't money. It wasn't a code to some digital vault. It was something far heavier. Proof. Proof that the city that had laughed at him, scoffed at his dresser, stepped around him like trash, had been built, in part, on injustices his family had recorded and hidden away. For a moment, old anger flickered in him, hot and immediate. He imagined headlines, courtrooms, powerful men squirming in chairs. But then his gaze slid to Lily, who sat cross-legged in the grass, watching him with complete trust. And behind her, in his mind's eye, he saw the faces of the people he used to sleep beside under bridges and overpasses. Men and women whose stories no one wrote down, whose tragedies never made it into neatly bound journals. He let out a long breath. "What are you gonna do?" Lily asked, because children always go straight to the heart of things. "I don't know yet," he said. "Should we tell somebody?" "Maybe," he murmured. "But not just anybody." They carried the box and its contents back into the house. Dan spread the documents across the dining table, weighing each one down with old ceramic cups so they didn't curl. He studied them until his head hurt. Names he recognized from street signs and building plaques popped up again and again. Foundations, trusts, companies still operating in the city. The past wasn't dead. It was alive, humming beneath the surface of everything, like wires buried under concrete. He thought of the dresser back in their new living room in the city, how it had sat there while people pointed cameras at him, laughing, how inside it, inches from their jeers, $30 million had slept quietly. And now this, a second vault, hidden under roots, knowledge instead of cash. "Grandma could have done something," he said aloud, more to himself than to Lily. "Why didn't she?" Lily shrugged, twisting a strand of hair. "Maybe she wanted you to." He met her eyes. "That's a lot to ask of somebody." "You always say we help people when we can," she replied with blunt simplicity. "Maybe this is how." The words lodged in his chest. He used to give his blanket away on the coldest nights if he thought someone else needed it more. Used to share a small, stale sandwich 3 ways. Used to walk the city's forgotten edges with nothing but stubbornness keeping him upright. He had felt useless then, powerless. Now, in front of him, lay the strange outline of a different kind of power. Not the kind that bought cars or houses or influence, the kind that could tilt the moral balance of a place, even a little. He picked up a map that showed a cluster of properties once owned by families whose names he didn't know. Many of those properties were now public spaces. Some had been empty lots for decades. His mind began to move in a new direction, restoring what can be restored without setting the whole place on fire. He couldn't go back in time and undo anything, but maybe he could steer the future. Later that week, after carefully packing the box and journal into the trunk, he drove back to the city with Lily. The dresser greeted them when they walked through the door of their small house, its familiar silhouette anchoring the living room. For the first time, it felt less like a burden and more like a hinge, something on which entire doors had swung open. Dan called Grayson. When the lawyer answered, Dan didn't waste words. "I found the rest," he said. There was a pause on the other end. "I wondered if you would," Grayson replied quietly. "Bring it in. But Dan, be sure, once we open this particular door, it won't close easily." "I'm not sure," Dan admitted. "That's why I'm calling you." The meeting in Grayson's office was quieter than their previous ones. No celebratory coffee, no talk of account balances. Just the two of them and the box between them on the polished table, the city skyline pressing in through the glass. Grayson read in silence for a long time, his eyes moving across the pages with growing gravity. When he finally set the journal down, his expression was more somber than Dan had ever seen. "This," Grayson said softly, tapping a finger on one of the documents, "could blow up half the city council if we trace the corporate bloodlines far enough. Some of those companies evolved, merged, changed names, but the roots are all here." "What happens if we go public?" Dan asked. "Investigations, lawsuits, years in court, retaliation, your family name front and center. They'd question your past, your time on the streets, try to discredit you, blame your grandmother, say these are forgeries. They'd fight like hell to keep anything from shifting. Can we win?" Grayson took a slow breath. "Maybe, eventually. But you need to ask yourself what winning looks like. Are you trying to punish or to repair?" Dan stared at the documents scattered between them. He thought of nights under overpasses, of booted feet kicking him awake, of people looking right through him like he was made of fog. He thought of the laughter, the pointing, of the videos that called him crazy for pushing a dresser when he didn't even have a roof. Part of him wanted to blast every name on those pages across the biggest screen in the city and watch them squirm. But another part, a quieter, older part, the piece his grandmother had nurtured, held him back. Repair, not revenge. "What if," he said slowly, "we use it differently?" "Go on," Grayson prompted. "What if we leverage it?" Dan continued. "Not to burn everything down, to build something, a fund, a foundation, whatever you want to call it, for housing, for services, for the people who get stepped over and forgotten. We go to them, the companies, the families who inherited all this, and we tell them, help fix what your fathers and grandfathers broke, or we let the truth out." Grayson sat back, considering. "Quiet justice," he murmured. "Restoration by pressure instead of spectacle. They get to keep their shiny names on their buildings," Dan said. "But some of their money gets redirected to the places no one puts their names on. Shelters, clinics, schools, places like that. You realize that still makes you a target," Grayson said. "They won't like being cornered." "I've been a target before," Dan replied, voice steady. "For less reason than this." Grayson's gaze softened in a way Dan hadn't seen before. Not pity, respect. "We can structure it," the lawyer said at last. "Discreetly, legally. We'll start with a few, those most vulnerable to exposure. If we do it right, the city gets what it's owed in a form that actually helps the people who need it most." Over the following months, quiet conversations began taking place behind closed doors. Letters delivered by hand, files slid across polished desks. Some of the powerful men and women they approached blustered, threatened, scoffed. But once they saw the depth and detail of the records Elias had kept, once they realized how far the branches of this particular tree reached, many changed their tune. Agreements were drafted. Anonymous donations flowed into newly created funds. Programs sprang up in neighborhoods that had been forgotten for decades. Job training centers, mental health clinics, small apartment buildings renovated into clean, low-cost housing. No one knew exactly where the money came from. The press speculated. Rumors flickered through the streets like passing headlights. But only a handful of people ever knew the truth. That it all began under an oak tree on a plot of land owned by a family no one had bothered to really see. Sometimes, when Dan walked through the city now, past those new centers and shelters, he would see faces that reminded him of his own from years ago. Tired, wary, but still flickering with the stubborn spark that refused to go out. If they recognized him from the old videos, they rarely said anything. Occasionally, someone would stop him. "You're that guy," they'd say, eyes narrowing in thought. "With the dresser?" He would nod, unsure what else to say. "Heard you got rich," they'd add, half curious, half envious. "Something like that," he'd answer. And then sometimes, just sometimes, another recognition would settle in their gaze, not of the viral caricature, but of the man who knew what cold concrete felt like through thin fabric. Those were the conversations that lasted, the ones where they talked about where to find help, about which centers treated people like humans instead of problems, about the fact that someone had started funding those places without asking for a plaque on the wall. At home, the dresser stood in its usual corner. Lily grew taller year by year, until one day she could rest her chin on its top. Her fingers traced the same scratches he'd once clutched while pushing it through rain and wind. "Do you ever think about getting rid of it?" she asked him one evening, as twilight seeped through the windows, painting the room in muted blues. "No," he said, almost before she finished the question. Then he paused. "I used to think of it as this weight I was dragging around, proof I was stuck in the past. People laughed because they thought I was crazy to hang on to it." "They were wrong," she said. "Maybe," he replied. "Maybe not. They just saw what they could see. A man with nothing holding on to something he shouldn't be able to afford to care about. They couldn't know what was inside." Lily smiled, resting her cheek against the wood. "I like that we do," she said. There were still bad days. Money didn't erase memory. When the rain came hard and fast, his body remembered the sting of it on exposed skin. When he passed an alley that smelled like damp cardboard and old exhaust, his chest tightened. He never stopped carrying those years with him. They had carved themselves into him too deeply. But that was part of why the dresser stayed. It reminded him of the nights he'd slept against it to shield Lily from wind, of the cold mornings when he'd thought the future was just a long, gray hallway with no doors, of the moment a hidden panel dropped open and changed everything, not because of the money alone, but because of what came after. On the anniversary of the day he found the drawer, he drove Lily back out to the old house. The oak trees still stood watch, patient and tall. The hole they'd dug was filled and grown over now, as if the land had pulled its secrets back around itself like a cloak. They stood beneath the oldest tree in silence for a while. The air smelled of damp earth and leaves. "Do you ever wish Grandma had just told you everything straight?" Lily asked. "No riddles, no secrets. Just, here it is?" Dan thought about that, about all the steps between the streets and this moment. The weight of the dresser, the click of the panel, the shock of the numbers on the page, the ache of discovering that money solved some problems and left others untouched, the journal under the floor, the box under the roots, the choices that followed. "If she had," he said quietly, "I don't think I would have been the same person by the time I got here. I might have used it differently, worse, or not at all." "So she waited until you were ready," Lily said. "Or until life made me ready," he replied. They stood there as the wind moved through the branches above, the rustle sounding almost like whispers, almost like an old woman's soft laugh. On the drive back to the city, Lily fell asleep with her head leaning against the window. Street lights flicked past, casting her face in alternating shadow and light. Dan drove in that strange, reflective quiet that only comes when the road stretches out just long enough to loosen thoughts from where they hide. Once, he had been a homeless man with a child and an old dresser people pointed at and mocked. Now he was something else, though he wasn't sure there was a name for it. A custodian, maybe, of money, of history, of people no one knew they owed anything to. He pulled into their driveway and sat for a moment before waking Lily. In the house, the dresser waited, the same as ever, and not the same at all. He walked over to it, laid his palm flat against its side, and closed his eyes. He thought of his grandmother, of Elias, of every unseen pair of hands that had built and carried and hidden and hoped. He thought of the men in suits who now signed quiet checks, not out of kindness, but out of pressure, and of the people who didn't care where the help came from, only that it was finally there, somewhere, in another version of this life. Maybe he had abandoned the dresser on the curb, given in to the voices that called it useless, crazy, dead weight. In that version, the drawer never opened, the key never turned, the roots kept their silence. But in this version, a man who had been stripped of everything decided, stubbornly, to keep hold of one impossible thing, and that impossible thing had opened the world. He let his hand fall back to his side, the wood's warmth lingering against his skin. The dresser made no sound. It didn't need to. Some stories end with fireworks, with sirens, with loud, clattering declarations. His ended here, in the soft quiet of a small room, with a worn piece of furniture and a future that no longer felt like an accusation. Outside, the city went on humming, busy, indifferent, unaware of how much of its balance now depended on secrets buried under roots and in drawers. Inside, a father and his daughter moved through their evening, the past and the future layered around them like invisible film frames, each one shaped by a choice no one else had seen. And somewhere in the middle of all that, in the narrow space between what had been taken and what had been given back, something fragile and stubborn had taken root again in Dan's chest. Not anger, not greed, something quieter. The simple, astonishing possibility of peace